In the early hours of May 29, 1453, as dawn broke over the golden waters of the Bosphorus, a single man's decision would seal the fate of an empire that had endured for over 1,000 years. His name was Giovanni Giustiniani, and what he did in those final moments would echo through history as one of the most controversial acts of betrayal ever recorded. But was it really betrayal, or was it something far more complex? The answer lies buried in the rubble of Constantinople's shattered walls and in the blood-soaked earth where the last Roman emperor made his final stand. This is the story of how the mightiest city in the world fell not just to cannons and courage, but to a moment of human weakness that changed the course of civilization itself. By the time you finish watching this video, you'll understand how a single wound, a moment of panic, and a desperate retreat opened the gates to an empire that had stood since the time of Christ. The year 1453 was a time when empires hung by threads and the world balanced on the edge of transformation. In the east, a young sultan named Mehmed II sat on the Ottoman throne, his eyes fixed westward on the greatest prize in the known world, Constantinople, the city that had been the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire for over a millennium, the last remnant of ancient Rome, the gateway between Europe and Asia. And by 1453, it was dying. Once, Constantinople had been home to 500,000 souls. Its harbors had bristled with merchant ships from every corner of the known world. Its palaces had glittered with gold and silk. Its walls had turned back army after army, earning it the reputation as the most impregnable city on earth. But those days were long gone. The Byzantine Empire, which had once stretched from Italy to the Caucasus, had withered to little more than the city itself and a handful of scattered territories. Where once great neighborhoods had thrived, now there were empty fields within the massive walls. The population had dwindled to perhaps 50,000 people, rattling around in a city built for 10 times that number. Emperor Constantine XI Palaeologos knew his empire was living on borrowed time. Every morning he walked the battlements of the Theodosian Walls, those legendary fortifications that had protected Constantinople for 1,000 years, and saw the cracks that no amount of mortar could truly repair. Not just in the stones, but in the very foundations of his realm. His treasury was nearly empty. His army numbered fewer than 7,000 men. His navy consisted of just 26 ships, most of them belonging to Italian merchants who owed no true loyalty to Byzantium. Yet Constantine refused to abandon his ancestral throne. When Mehmed's ambassadors came offering him safe passage and a comfortable retirement in exchange for surrender, the emperor's response was defiant. Constantinople had never fallen to a siege, and by God's grace, it never would. But defiance alone would not stop what was coming from the east. Sultan Mehmed II was 21 years old, but he possessed the calculating mind of a seasoned conqueror. Where his father and grandfather had failed to take Constantinople, he would succeed. This was not merely ambition, it was destiny. In his mind, he was not just another Turkish warlord seeking plunder. He was the heir to Caesar, the rightful successor to the Roman Empire itself. And every night, he sat in his tent drawing sketches of Constantinople's walls, planning exactly where his cannons would tear them apart. Mehmed's preparations were unlike anything the medieval world had ever seen. He secured peace treaties with Hungary and Venice, ensuring no relief would come to Constantine from the north or west. He built the fortress of Rumelihisarı at the narrowest point of the Bosphorus, effectively cutting off Constantinople's lifeline to the Black Sea. Most importantly, he commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Urban to build him the largest cannons the world had ever seen. Urban had first offered his services to the Byzantines. The irony was bitter. Here was a weapon that could shatter Constantinople's ancient walls, and Emperor Constantine simply could not afford to pay for it. When Urban approached him with designs for revolutionary artillery, Constantine had to turn him away. The imperial treasury was empty, so Urban took his plans to Mehmed instead, and the young sultan paid him handsomely. The very weapon that would destroy Constantinople could have saved it, if only the emperor had possessed the gold to buy it. The cannon Urban built for Mehmed was a monster of bronze and iron, 27 feet long, with a barrel over 2 feet in diameter. It could hurl stone balls weighing more than 1,300 pounds over a mile through the air. When Urban test-fired it outside the Ottoman capital of Edirne, the thunderous roar shattered windows and sent pregnant women into premature labor. Mehmed watched the demonstration with satisfaction. When he asked Urban if this weapon could breach Constantinople's walls, the engineer's reply was confident. Not only could it destroy the Theodosian Walls, he boasted, it could reduce the very walls of Babylon to dust. But cannons alone would not take Constantinople. Mehmed assembled the largest army the Ottomans had ever fielded. Estimates vary, but most historians agree his force numbered between 80,000 and 160,000 men. At its core were the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry. These were not ordinary soldiers, but warriors taken as boys from Christian families, converted to Islam, and trained from childhood to be the perfect fighting machine. They knew no loyalty save to the Sultan, no fear save disappointing him. They were disciplined, fanatical, and utterly deadly. Supporting the Janissaries were regular troops from across the Ottoman Empire, Anatolian infantry with their curved swords and composite bows, irregular Bashi bazooks, expendable cannon fodder whose job was to exhaust the defenders before the real assault began, cavalry units that could strike like lightning and disappear into the morning mist, engineers to operate the siege equipment, miners to tunnel under the walls, and looming over it all, Urban's great cannon and dozens of smaller artillery pieces that would pound Constantinople's defenses day and night. As winter gave way to spring in 1453, this vast host began its march toward Constantinople. Villages emptied as the army approached. Peasants fled to the forests or sailed across the Bosphorus, carrying tales of an endless sea of tents and banners stretching to the horizon. The very earth seemed to tremble under the weight of so many marching feet. Inside Constantinople, Constantine knew the end was approaching. He sent desperate appeals to the Christian kingdoms of the West, begging for aid against the Muslim invaders. The response was devastating in its indifference. Hungary was dealing with its own problems and refused to help. Venice sent polite letters but no ships. The Pope saw the crisis as an opportunity to force the Orthodox Church to submit to Rome, demanding religious union as the price for any assistance. Even when the Orthodox clergy grudgingly agreed, the people of Constantinople rioted in the streets, shouting that they would rather see the Sultan's turban in the city than the Pope's tiara. As Mehmed's army drew closer, a few brave souls did answer Constantine's call. From Genoa came a ship carrying 700 men under the command of a mercenary captain named Giovanni Giustiniani. This man would become the key figure in our story, the one whose actions would determine whether Constantinople lived or died. But who was Giustiniani? And why did Constantine entrust him with the defense of the most critical section of the city's walls? Giovanni Giustiniani Longo was born into a noble Genoese family around 1418, but as a younger son, he had no inheritance waiting for him. Instead, he chose the life of a soldier of fortune, selling his sword to whoever could pay his price. By the time he reached Constantinople, he was 35 years old and had earned a reputation as one of Europe's finest siege specialists. He had defended walled cities before and knew every trick of the trade. When Emperor Constantine saw this grizzled warrior step off his ship with 400 seasoned fighters, he must have felt the first spark of hope he had known in months. Constantine immediately appointed Giustiniani as commander of the land defenses, giving him authority over the most vulnerable section of Constantinople's walls. It was a desperate gamble, placing the fate of the empire in the hands of a foreign mercenary whose ultimate loyalty was to gold rather than God or country. But Constantine had little choice. His own generals were few, and his soldiers inexperienced in siege warfare. If anyone could hold the walls against Mehmed's assault, it would be this battle-scarred Genoese captain. Yet even as Giustiniani organized the defenses and inspired the garrison with his confidence, dark questions lingered. What would happen when the real test came? When the Ottoman cannons began their devastating bombardment and the Janissaries launched their final assault, would this mercenary stand firm? Or would he calculate that his contract did not require him to die for a lost cause? The stage was set for one of history's greatest sieges, and at its heart lay a fundamental question of loyalty, courage, and human nature that would soon be answered in the most dramatic way possible. On April 5th, 1453, the horizon outside Constantinople darkened with a sight that chilled the blood of every defender on the walls. Like a black tide rolling across the landscape, Mehmed's vast army spread across the hills and valleys surrounding the city. Banners fluttered in the spring breeze, thousands upon thousands of them, bearing the crescents and stars of the Ottoman Empire. The thunder of drums echoed off the ancient stones as regiment after regiment took their positions. The siege of Constantinople had begun. Giustiniani stood atop the outer wall, his weathered hands gripping the stone battlements as he surveyed the enemy host. Even for a veteran of countless campaigns, the sight was overwhelming. Endless rows of tents stretched toward the horizon, punctuated by the glint of armor and weapons. Smoke rose from 100 cooking fires. The sound of hammering filled the air as engineers assembled siege equipment. And there, being dragged slowly into position by teams of oxen and hundreds of men, was Urban's monstrous cannon. The Genoese captain had seen many armies in his time, but nothing like this. This was not just a military force. It was an entire civilization on the march. Mehmed had brought craftsmen to build his siege works, miners to tunnel under the walls, sailors to blockade the harbor, and administrators to govern the city once it fell. The young sultan was not planning for a quick raid or a demonstration of power. He was planning for conquest, and he had brought everything necessary to achieve it. Constantine joined Giustiniani on the walls, and the two men stood in silence for a long moment, absorbing the magnitude of what faced them. The emperor's face was drawn with exhaustion and worry, but his voice remained steady when he finally spoke. 7,000 men against more than 100,000. It seemed impossible, but these walls had held against impossible odds before. They would hold again, God willing. Giustiniani nodded, though privately he was calculating the odds with the cold precision of a professional soldier. He had seen what modern artillery could do to medieval fortifications. The Theodosian Walls were magnificent, but they had been built in an age of catapults and ballistae, not cannons that could hurl massive stone balls with devastating force. Still, he had accepted Constantine's gold and given his word. He would hold the walls or die trying. The bombardment began on April 12th with a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Urban's great cannon spoke first, its voice a thunderclap that echoed across the Bosphorus and could be heard miles away. The massive stone ball struck the outer wall with tremendous force, sending chunks of masonry flying and leaving a crater in stones that had stood for 1,000 years. Smaller cannons joined the chorus, their shots hammering the walls in a relentless rhythm that would continue for weeks. Inside the city, civilians huddled in their homes as the bombardment raged. Each impact sent tremors through the ground, rattling windows and causing buildings to sway. Children cried in terror while their parents whispered prayers. The constant noise was almost as devastating as the physical damage, wearing down the defenders' nerves and making sleep nearly impossible. But the Byzantines were not passive victims. Each night, as soon as darkness fell, repair crews emerged from the city to work frantically on the damaged walls. They hauled stones and timber through the rubble-strewn streets, mixing mortar by torchlight and racing against time to strengthen the defenses before dawn brought the resumption of the Ottoman bombardment. Giustiniani was everywhere during these night repairs, encouraging the workers, directing the placement of reinforcements, and gradually earning the respect and loyalty of Constantine's soldiers. The Genoese captain proved himself a master of defensive warfare. When sections of the outer wall were demolished by the Ottoman cannons, he constructed earthworks and palisades behind them, creating new defensive positions that were actually harder to assault than the original fortifications. When Urban's monster cannon created a massive breach near the gate of St. Romanos, Giustiniani personally led work parties to build a crescent-shaped rampart that turned the gap into a killing ground for any attacker brave enough to enter it. Day after day, the pattern continued. Ottoman cannons would blast away at the walls during daylight hours, while Byzantine repair crews worked through the night to undo the damage. It was a race between destruction and reconstruction, with the fate of the empire hanging in the balance. The defenders were exhausted, running on little sleep and dwindling supplies, but somehow they held on. Giustiniani's presence seemed to give them strength, his calm confidence infectious even in the face of overwhelming odds. Mehmed grew increasingly frustrated as the days passed. His cannons were doing tremendous damage to the walls, but the defenders kept repairing them faster than he could knock them down. The great breach near the gate of St. Romanos should have been the key to victory. Yet Giustiniani had turned it into a fortress within a fortress. Worse, Urban's massive cannon was proving to be as much liability as asset. The tremendous forces involved in firing it caused cracks in the barrel, and after several weeks of constant use, the monster weapon finally burst during firing, killing Urban and several of his assistants. But Mehmed was nothing if not resourceful. If he could not batter down the walls quickly enough, he would find other ways to take the city. His engineers began digging tunnels under the fortifications, planning to plant explosives that would bring down entire sections at once. His navy launched attacks on the harbor defenses, trying to break the chain that protected the Golden Horn. He even attempted to have his ships dragged overland on greased logs to bypass the harbor defenses entirely, a feat of engineering that stunned both friend and foe. Each of these strategies was met and countered by the defenders. Giustiniani organized countermining operations, sending his own diggers to intercept the Ottoman tunnels. Constantine's few remaining ships, reinforced by vessels from Genoa and Venice, fought desperately to keep the harbor open. When Mehmed succeeded in getting some of his fleet into the Golden Horn, the Byzantines stretched a pontoon bridge across the water and used it to launch surprise attacks on the Ottoman ships. As April gave way to May, both sides were reaching the limits of endurance. The Ottoman army had been camped outside Constantinople for nearly 2 months, and disease was beginning to take its toll. Supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Some of Mehmed's advisors began suggesting that perhaps it was time to lift the siege and try again another year. But Mehmed had staked everything on this campaign. To withdraw now would be seen as weakness, an invitation for his enemies, both foreign and domestic, to move against him. More than that, he could sense that the defenders were weakening. Intelligence reports spoke of growing desperation within the city, of food shortages and plummeting morale. The walls might look intact from a distance, but he knew they had been patched and repatched so many times that they were held together more by determination than by mortar. The young Sultan made his decision. One final, overwhelming assault would break the defender's will and give him the prize he had dreamed of since childhood. He would throw everything he had at the walls in a coordinated attack that would begin before dawn and continue until either Constantinople fell or his army was destroyed in the attempt. As May 28th turned to May 29th, neither Mehmed nor Constantine slept. The Ottoman camp buzzed with activity as weapons were sharpened and armor checked. Assault ladders were prepared, and the surviving cannons were loaded for one last bombardment. In the city, Giustiniani made his final rounds of the defenses, speaking quietly with his men and making sure every section of wall was properly manned. The Genoese captain had fought in many sieges, but he had never felt the weight of responsibility as heavily as he did that night. The fate of the last Roman Empire rested on his shoulders, and those of the few thousand exhausted men under his command. In a few hours, when the Ottoman assault began, every decision he made could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. What neither Giustiniani nor anyone else in Constantinople could have known was that this night would test more than just military skill and courage. It would reveal the true nature of loyalty itself and the thin line that separates heroism from betrayal. The greatest siege in medieval history was about to reach its climax, and at its heart lay a question that would haunt historians for centuries to come. As the first pale light of dawn crept over the walls of Constantinople on May 29th, the silence was broken by the deep rumble of Ottoman war drums. The sound rolled across the hills like thunder, joined by the haunting wail of horns and the battle cries of thousands of warriors preparing for what they knew would be the final assault. In the distance, Mehmed's banners snapped in the morning breeze, and the young Sultan himself could be seen mounted on his warhorse, surveying the city that had defied him for 55 days. Giovanni Giustiniani stood at his post near the gate of St. Romanos, the section of wall that had taken the worst punishment from the Ottoman cannons. His armor was dented and scarred from weeks of fighting, and his face bore the lines of a man who had not slept properly in months. Around him, his Genoese soldiers checked their weapons one last time, their faces grim but determined. These men had followed their captain across half of Europe, and they would follow him into hell if necessary. The attack began with a wave of Bashi bazooks, the irregular troops that Mehmed used as expendable shock forces. They came screaming across the rubble-strewn ground between the Ottoman lines and the walls, carrying crude weapons and makeshift shields. Their job was not to take the city, but to exhaust the defenders and use up their ammunition. Wave after wave of these unfortunate souls threw themselves against the Byzantine defenses, only to be cut down by arrows, crossbow bolts, and the occasional blast of Greek fire. For 2 hours, the slaughter continued. The ground before the walls became carpeted with bodies as the Bashi bazooks pressed their hopeless assault. But Giustiniani could see the method in Mehmed's apparent madness. Each wave forced the defenders to expend precious arrows and bolts. Each attack wore down men who were already exhausted from weeks of fighting. The Genoese captain conserved his strength and that of his men as much as possible, knowing that the real test was yet to come. As the sun climbed higher, the second wave began. These were professional soldiers, Anatolian troops with proper armor and training. They advanced in disciplined formations, their shields locked together as they approached the walls. Behind them came siege ladders and portable bridges, tools designed to get them over or through the Byzantine defenses. The fighting became more intense, more desperate. Hand-to-hand combat erupted along the ramparts as Ottoman soldiers managed to scale the walls, only to be met by Giustiniani's men with sword and axe. The Genoese captain was everywhere at once, it seemed. When a section of wall looked ready to fall, he appeared with reinforcements. When his men's courage began to waver, his voice rang out above the din of battle, steadying their nerves and reminding them of their duty. He fought like a man possessed, his sword rising and falling in deadly arcs, his presence alone worth 100 ordinary soldiers. But even Giustiniani could not be in all places at once, and slowly, inevitably, the Ottoman pressure began to tell. Sections of the outer wall that had been patched and repatched began to crumble under the weight of the assault. Defenders fell, struck down by arrows or overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The Byzantines were fighting magnificently, but they were being bled white by an enemy that seemed to have an endless supply of fresh troops. Then came the sound that every defender had been dreading. The deep, rhythmic pounding of drums that announced the approach of the Janissaries. These were Mehmed's elite troops, the cream of the Ottoman army. They advanced in perfect formation, their white felt caps distinctive even at a distance, their weapons gleaming in the morning Sunday. Unlike the wild charges of the Bashi bazooks or the steady advance of the Anatolian troops, the Janissaries moved with the confidence of men who had never known defeat. At their head rode Mehmed himself, close enough to the fighting to inspire his men but far enough back to direct the battle. The young Sultan's presence electrified his army. Here was their leader, their Caesar, sharing the dangers of the assault with them. If the Janissaries could break through at this point, Constantinople would fall within the hour. Giustiniani gathered his remaining reserves for what he knew would be the final stand. Perhaps 3,000 men, all that remained of Constantinople's once proud army, stood ready to meet the flower of Ottoman military might. The Genoese captain looked along the line of weary faces, seeing in them the last hope of an empire that had endured for over a millennium. These men, many of them foreigners fighting for pay rather than patriotism, were all that stood between Mehmed and his dream of conquest. The clash, when it came, was titanic. Janissaries swarmed up the walls like ants, their scaling ladders seeming to sprout from every damaged section of the fortifications. The defenders met them with desperate fury, knowing that this was their last chance. Sword rang against sword, spear thrust against shield, and men died by the dozens in the narrow confines of the ramparts. In the thick of the fighting, Giustiniani seemed to bear a charmed life. Ottoman arrows whistled around him without finding their mark. Enemy swords turned aside from his armor as if guided by divine providence. His men took heart from their captain's apparent invincibility, fighting with renewed vigor as they saw him cut down foe after foe. But then, in the space of a heartbeat, everything changed. A crossbow bolt, fired from somewhere in the chaos of battle, found its mark. Giustiniani staggered, blood spreading across his chest, his sword falling from suddenly nerveless fingers. The wound was not mortal, but in that moment of shock and pain, the Genoese captain made a choice that would echo through history. He turned from the walls and stumbled toward the gates, calling for his men to carry him to his ship. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Seeing their commander retreat, the Genoese soldiers abandoned their posts and followed him. A gap opened in the defenses that had held for 55 days. Ottoman warriors poured through like water through a broken dam. Emperor Constantine himself tried to rally the fleeing troops, but it was too late. The last Roman emperor died sword in hand, fighting to the end as his empire crumbled around him. Was Giustiniani a coward who betrayed an empire in its darkest hour? Or was he simply a mortal man who reached the limits of human endurance and made a choice that any of us might have made in his place? The truth, like so many truths in history, lies somewhere between legend and reality. What cannot be disputed is that on that May morning in 1453, a single moment of human weakness opened the gates to a new world, ending one age and beginning another in the space of a heartbeat.